Man, another week has gone by. Welcome to Unlapped. I'm Nicole Briscoe alongside Laurence Edmondson. I say alongside, we're actually like separated by the entire world, but that's just how it is. These weeks are flying by. So thank you so much for joining us. Remember, if you're listening to wherever you get your podcasts, just give us a review, hit us up with those 5 stars. You can also remember to catch us on the ESPN F1 YouTube channel where they're all season long. So subscribe, like, you know the drill. Laurence, we should be ashamed of ourselves, honestly. We have 1 point in our league of terrible picking. That's what we should call it. The terrible picking league.
It is a terrible picking league, but I'd like to say it's 1 point more than Nate, who
That
didn't
is
even
true.
participate last time round because we asked him very politely. He was on holiday, but we asked him very politely, can you send through your predictions?
And
And
he
he
did.
did not. Not that it probably would have made any difference because he'd gone the same as us, which was Max Verstappen in 3rd place, Oscar Piastri in 2nd place, and Lando Norris in 1st place. We both chose that independently, I should add.
Yes.
Then he wouldn't have got any points either because
No.
despite roughly drivers in those positions, I mean, Max was 4th and Oscar obviously won and Lando was 2nd.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite bang on. And that's why this is a very difficult game.
I know. I
Often
thought
gets
we got credit when we started this. I thought we got credit if we had somebody like just on the podium. I didn't realize that we had to have it exactly right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Look, let's just be honest about the situation. China was wild, but China was wild for all of the things that happened off the track and particularly after the race. And we're recording this episode before any additional breaking news has happened. So like I think it's important for us to just live in a world and have the conversation where Red Bull is going to be making some changes. But as of this record, like Liam Lawson is still in the Red Bull car. So I think that's the biggest news that's just lingering out there. In what world does Red Bull not make a change?
In a world where they meet, which they're meant to do today, Tuesday, it's very late Tuesday for me. I'm in Japan. It's very early Tuesday for you. But somewhere in the middle is the United Kingdom and Milton Keynes, where Red Bull are based. And in a meeting there where they find something in Liam Lawson's data from the first 2 races where they say, you know what if that can be extrapolated over a full race weekend? What if that is the little beacon of hope that we're looking for? Sadly, I mean, looking at it from the outside, and, you know, I don't mean this in a nasty way, but I couldn't see anything really from the first few races. Okay, there's the odd race lap where maybe he's got fresher tires on, he goes faster, but really Lawson is not looking like the driver that Red Bull need. And remember, Red Bull broke a 2-year contract with Sergio Perez, which involved paying Perez money to bring in Lawson because they thought he was going to do a better job. And I mean, we didn't think you could do much worse than Perez last year, but Lawson is certainly giving it a go. And it's early days. I don't want to be too harsh on him. I think this is much, in fact, it is a team problem and not a driver problem, I personally believe. But it doesn't make any difference right now if Lawson isn't able to perform. I mean, what do you think, Nicole? Where does this go?
That's the part that I think that's the part that blows my mind a little bit. There are 2 parts of this. One, if you're Red Bull and you make the decision to go with Liam Lawson over Yuki Tsunoda, one, you know the situation you're getting into. Like Lawson is technically a rookie. Like he has some experience in a car, but when you're putting a rookie in a car that historically, if you ask other teammates of Max Verstappen along the way, they will tell you it's one of the toughest cars there is to drive. Like Alex Albon is like, it's incredibly sharp. And then it starts to mess with like how you approach the race weekend and all of these things. So the situation that you're putting your new driver in, this is not a new situation. This shouldn't come as a surprise. So when you then make the decision to put a rookie in the car, what do you expect? What do you think is going to happen? There are going to be some growing pains. There's going to be a learning curve. Now, look, I understand that they spent a lot of money to get Perez out of the car. I understand that they spent that money to make a change to get something out of their new driver. But to make that decision after 2 races where the team also has to take some ownership and take some responsibility for those issues, it almost feels slightly too soon. But then I also understand, like, look, they made the change. They need action now. But then that takes me back to the initial point that I made. If you needed action now, then why didn't you go with the more sure thing? And in my mind, that's Yuki. Like, that's the decision you should have made to begin with.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, this is the reality they're now living with, is that at some point, and it's not entirely clear who made that pick of one over the other, but I think they've basically felt that Lawson was more adaptable, had a higher ceiling, bit of a potential, and also kind of was able to get his elbows out a bit more in racing. I think that's a direct quote from Christian Horner: get your elbows out and be able to race. Now, he's had to do that because he's been starting so far back. But even that quality seems to have been lost just because it's so difficult. And you mentioned all those previous drivers who said that this car is very difficult to drive. That's absolutely right. And then there's another one who says it's incredibly difficult to drive, and that's Max Verstappen. Now, he is able to live with the weird characteristics of it, but I think there's this misconception that they've built a car for Max and it's built around Max's driving style. That's not entirely true. They've built a car for performance, and it just turns out that the only person that can extract that performance is Max Verstappen, and you have to be on the level of Max Verstappen in terms of ability, but also in terms of confidence. And of course, winning 4 world championships with that team, being there since 2016, his confidence in the team has built. He knows when he's going through the setup sheet, right, let's change that. It's going to have exactly that impact. Let's change this. It's going to have that impact. Lawson doesn't have any of that right now. He's kind of getting a bit as he goes around. And the problem is that he can't live with the way this car is very much, in F1 terms, what we say is on the nose. So it's very, it turns in sharply, but then it loses the rear. So it turns in sharply. He seems to have a bit of understeer mid-corner, actually, but then loses the rear on the exit. And he can't live with that. And because he can't live with that, he then can't get the tires working properly at all. So they fall out of their temperature window. And, you just have to look at the rest of the grid and the fluctuations in performance of a number of teams so far in these 2 races. And you can see how important that is to get the car and the tires, especially, in the right window. And Lawson is completely unable to do that. And that's
Literally
why we've got,
snowballs.
and it snowballs because you have a 7/10 gap in qualifying. And because it's so tight this year, that can be the difference between Max, top 3, top 4, and Lawson at the back of the field. And then when you extrapolate that over a race, it snowballs even more because, China was a very good example of, if you get stuck behind other cars, you destroy your front tires and then you can't go anywhere. And overtaking wasn't actually as easy as it has been in previous years there. So, yeah, I really feel for the guy, but also he's struggling to keep his head above water in that Red Bull. And I feel like Tsunoda, it's not guaranteed we might have exactly the same issue, but there is an element right now with Red Bull where, it's not a charity. They're not running it because Lawson wants to be a Formula One driver, wants to be a Red Bull driver. They're running it for championship points. And if Lawson is consistently finishing on 0 points and not even close to the points, and Max is second in the championship, which he is, then perhaps, niceties go out the window and you have to bring in Tsunoda just to see, as much as anything, if he can live with it.
And it would have been a significantly better weekend in China for Yuki and Isaac if they hadn't made the strategy decisions that they had made. Like, it would have been a better weekend. I think long term, and I do agree sort of with, there's always been something about Yuki that you can't put your finger on why Red Bull doesn't like him. And I think in the long run, you've got these 2 drivers, and Liam hasn't left the best impression in these first couple of races. I feel like Liam could be, quote unquote, demoted to Racing Bulls, and Yuki could be then promoted to Red Bull. But if Yuki doesn't perform, that's it. Like, where does Yuki go from there? But if Liam goes back to Racing Bulls and then puts it together and starts to show the potential and has his elbows out and does the things that Red Bull thought that they could get out of him, I think that there is, it's that ceiling thing that you discussed. So like this, there is potential there. And so, like, in my opinion, like, this almost isn't the end for Liam. But if Yuki then goes to that seat and doesn't do exactly what they need him to do, I think the conversation then very becomes, well, now what for Yuki? And I'm not sure that there is a solid answer for that. I'm not sure there is anything.
Yeah, I think Yuki's harder to place long term. Obviously, he has the links with Honda, which is why he ended up in the Red Bull family in the first place.
But that
But
goes
those links are going to
right.
be cut.
Right.
Those links are cut at the end of the year. Honda goes to Aston Martin. Now, I think it's a bit unfair to just look at Yuki and say he's only, well, it's very unfair to say he's only
I
in
totally
F1.
agree with you.
He's a Honda, because that's not the case anymore. The case
No.
is he's a very good, established racing driver in his own right, who this year especially is performing on another level. And I think the last 2 years we've seen progress from him, which there aren't many other drivers on the grid who have made that same upward trajectory across the last 2 seasons. So I think, Yuki has a very good, solid case to be on the grid, but it is hard to place where he would be if not. But if he goes to Red Bull and he performs, then Red Bull are probably going to be quite keen to keep him. Because the other thing that keeps going through my mind is, imagine a world where Max Verstappen had signed for Mercedes this year and Red Bull have been left with two drivers who couldn't drive the car, or perhaps one driver who could half drive it and another who couldn't. And where, Red Bull would be a back of the grid team, which is remarkable, really, isn't it? I mean, that's crazy. And also because Verstappen's future isn't really that solid going forward, I think Red Bull have to be a little bit careful and probably treat, all four of their drivers right now very, very well, because if any of them were to leave, I think they're going to have a problem in 2026. They've got Lindblad coming through, Arvin Lindblad in F2, looks like the real deal, but
So
still
did
very
Liam
young.
Lawson.
And this is the other issue with bringing young drivers through, is you just drop them in a car and then expect them to perform, and that's the tricky thing, and that's where it seems Red Bull just make the same mistake over and over again. Alex Albon was an example, Pierre Gasly was an example, and now you've got Liam Lawson. And then, there's also plenty of examples of Red Bull drivers who didn't make the Red Bull grade. Albon and Gasly, I'm also thinking Carlos Sainz, never quite got their break with Red Bull that they needed and went and were very successful elsewhere. So, yeah, remarkable situation. And I really think it points to an issue at Red Bull, the team, the way they're developing that car, kind of obviously, but also the way they're bringing drivers, not necessarily into F1, because I think the steps they do prior to that are very good and they have a very good track record. But when they get to F1, they're just not giving them the time they need, probably not giving them the support they need. If you look at Kimi Antonelli at Mercedes, it's a very different relationship between the way Toto Wolff talks about Kimi Antonelli and the relationship they seem to have, and the one where, Helmut Marko and Christian Horner talk about Lawson or Hadjar, Marco's comments on Hadjar in Australia,
Like,
saying that it was embarrassing that he was crying after spinning on the first lap. So
let's just say, first of all, that's like toxic. That's literally toxic masculinity. That is a terribly old school way to think. It is disappointing across the board for a number of levels. But that sort of speaks to, how many times this year have I said to you, Red Bull has a lack of self-awareness? There is a culture that exists within Red Bull where some of those things, talking about a driver crying and being like, oh, that's embarrassing, that culture exists. Look last year with Christian Horner, I'm just going to say it, but also like the, oh, poor us, we got booed at the F175 event. We don't want to be like those guys. Like, you have to have self-awareness. I'm sorry. And that is almost like a culture thing, whether it's a PR side of it or whether it's their lack of self-awareness when it comes to developing the car, because it's almost like they're unaware of how, as wild as that can be, it's like they're not giving Max enough credit for the fact that maybe he is able to drive the shoebox and turn it into a world championship winning car. And they've almost taken that for granted. And because that then trickles down to how they seem to treat everyone else. And I don't know why I'm still baffled by it, but like, it's seemingly like their lack of self-awareness to me is just like, it every time something like this happens, I'm like, how did you not know this? How did you not see it? Like, you have a long history of this across the board. So the conversations, and again, we're having this conversation, you and me, we're having this conversation before Red Bull has officially done anything. But if you were to put like a number on it, like how likely, and let me just caveat, how likely before the race in Japan, how likely is it that you think Red Bull will actually make the change between Yuki and Liam?
Well, this is where listeners are listening to me and they already know the answer, so I can only make myself look stupid. But I'm going to say 85%, because when I left China, the last press conference we did, or kind of press huddle we did, was with Christian Horner, and I asked him directly, look, will Liam Lawson be in the car in Japan? Can you say yes or no? And he gave this wishy-washy answer. We're going to look at the data, and then we're going to see him. We're going to talk. Not even say that we're talking about him, but we're just going to look at his data and see how we can help him and all this kind of stuff. Now he got asked again, like he said that Lawson has a lot of pressure, and somebody very cleverly pointed out, well, if there's so much pressure on him, why don't you, leave it a little bit by saying he's definitely going to be in the car in Japan? And again, same answer, we're going to look at the data, blah, blah, blah. When I heard that, I was thinking 90-95% guy's gone. We're now on Tuesday, and I think, my mind hasn't really changed a huge amount. But, the only thing that's in my mind, back of my mind, saying that maybe it won't happen is that we had a very similar situation with Sergio Perez in the summer break last year, to the point that we had sources telling us, actually telling Nate, to, I'll give Nate the credit here, to Nate, that Perez was gone. And then there was a meeting and everything turned around and he wasn't gone anymore. So, as much as Red Bull are a mess one way, they also seem to be a mess the other way sometimes. And yeah. So I think it's very likely, but until I see the press release come out, I'm certainly not 100.
But also, just because they don't make a change before, just because they don't make a change before Japan does not mean that they won't make a change eventually. Like I'm not saying that your 85% is probably spot on, but I feel like just because he's given another opportunity in Japan, I wouldn't go into Bahrain or Saudi Arabia thinking, if I'm Liam, I wouldn't go into this situation being like, yes, my seat is safe. Probably not.
Yeah, the other thing
Okay,
about
but
Japan, and another good reason to keep Lawson in the car, again, this might all seem irrelevant if people are listening to it after announcement, is that Lawson knows Suzuka well. He raced in Super Formula, was very successful in Super Formula, which is basically Japanese Formula 2. And so it's a track that he knows kind of like the back of his hand. And you feel if he's going to perform anywhere, it's going to be there. And in contrast to Australia and China, two tracks that he didn't know. I mean, you can point to other rookies and say, well, look, they were perfectly fine at these tracks they didn't know. So, what's the big deal? But I think, yeah, if Lawson's going to be given a fair shout, and like I said earlier, it's not really about fairness. It's about Red Bull doing what they feel they need to do for their Formula One team. But if you are going to give him a fair shout, then at least let him drive Suzuka, because it is a circuit that he knows. Having said that, it's also a circuit where you need a lot of confidence in the car. And if that's lacking, then yeah, good luck to him. Good luck to him there as well.
so as much drama as there is at Red Bull, um, how would you describe the current situation at Ferrari?
It's not good, is it? I can't remember the last time, and I don't know if there has been a time where a team has had two cars disqualified for different reasons. Two cars disqualified, yes, it's not unusual for there be, something on the cars which gets them both chucked out. I think it happened to Renault a few years ago in Japan. But two cars for different reasons is really quite poor. And and we're not talking about a team that's rebuilding. If this was Ferrari, 3 years ago, it would kind of fit the bill. But this is a team that was supposed to be going into this year ready to fight for championships. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I want to say there is performance there. Of course, there was the glimmer of hope in the sprint race victory, Lewis Hamilton getting pole for the sprint and then going on to win it. That was all good news from a Ferrari perspective. And I kind of went into even Sunday, once the race had finished, thinking, well, at least there's something there. At least the performance is somewhere in that car. They just need to figure out how to access it more consistently. And then find out that two cars got disqualified is yeah, it is not good. And Lewis as well, it was a ride height issue. So basically they're running the ride too low, which meant that the plank at the bottom of the car, which basically is wood resin stuff, wore away by 0.5 millimeter more than it was meant to. I mean, that is a tiny amount, 0.5 millimeters. It's less than the width of a credit card. But still, to make that mistake, there's a reason teams don't get chucked out regularly for this. It's because, they're usually quite good at predicting it. I think the last time, funny enough, was Ferrari and Mercedes in Austin 2023. Lewis Hamilton,
It
Charles
was
Leclerc.
Lewis.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but a different
Mhm.
team. But yeah, so but still, you just would have thought you'd have that kind of stuff under control. And at least in Austin, there was a few excuses. It was bumpy. It was also the old sprint format where they couldn't change the setup in between the sprint race, and so they only had one practice session to get it right. I'm just so surprised that Ferrari got that wrong. And then of course Leclerc was underweight, which we saw happen with George Russell in Belgium
Sure.
last year. He won the race and then was underweight. It can happen if you change from a preconceived pre-race idea of doing two stops to one stop, because you're going to end up with a lot more tire wear on the tires than you expected, and therefore just the physical rubber that gets flung off means the car weight comes down. And that's what Ferrari said happened. But still, come on, like they've got a tough enough time as it is. They shouldn't be making these relatively simple mistakes.
It's a little bit like the number of times, and this is pre-Fred, like the number of times we would see strategy mistakes and like little errors where it was literally Ferrari shooting themselves in the foot. And then Fred came in and the vibe sort of changed and like they were never too high, they were never too low. We've talked about that already, like this season. Like Fred is the guy who's going to keep them calm when things go right. But some of those issues are like rearing their ugly head again. And it's different now. Like your expectations for Ferrari were always high because they're Ferrari. But I'm sorry, you cannot bring in Lewis Hamilton. You cannot bring in Lewis Hamilton with the expectations that just people have of Lewis Hamilton, but then you cannot bring in Lewis Hamilton with the expectations that your car is going to be great and go out and do exactly what happened in China. Like you have to be more buttoned up. You have to be better than that. So like if I'm in the Ferrari factory this week and early next week, like, what conversations are we having? What are we doing? How are we getting better?
It's a good question. I think more than anything, they need to look at the bits that are going right, the things like what happened in the sprint, and understand where that performance is. I think things like, there's no point in getting upset at people about being underweight and the plank wearing. You just got to make sure that lesson is thoroughly learned. There was during the height of the Mercedes success, it was always blame the problem, don't blame the people. And so each problem they used to say was, okay, it might have been caused by a person, but that's because that person wasn't properly equipped. They believe in all the staff that they had employed. They employed them for good reason. So you've got to look at what was that staff member doing wrong? Why did they make the mistake? And what was it that led them to make that mistake? So, and why wasn't there a double check or something? So I think those kind of stuff, that happens all the time in Formula One. It's often said as well that you learn far more from the races that you lose and you do badly than the ones you win, because there's bigger lessons to take from them, probably more obvious lessons. But I still think, yeah, they need to just really figure out where the performance is, because it seems when that car's in its happy spot, it's actually not bad. It's
Oh, it's
probably
great.
not on
Like,
McLaren level, but it's within a couple of tenths. And they need to find that, because problem with this season is that if you let the gaps get too big in the championship, and I know a lot of people say, well, you're getting ahead of yourself, it's only 2 races, but if you do let those gaps get too big, at what point do you say, you know what, we're going to halt our development of this year's car and focus on 2026? Because if you get 2026 wrong, then you've got, well, we're not quite sure
27
because
wrong.
they're talking about changing regulations, but at least 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe 2, but you got several years of dealing with the consequences of that.
And it's also not like I remind you like what happened last year. Like if you let the gap get too big, Lando
Yeah.
won the race in Miami and McLaren came on strong after that. And look at like the gap was already too big. It was already too much. It was insurmountable in the end. So it does not take long for that gap to get out there. And yes, it like that McLaren looks good. I don't know if that McLaren is as good as the 2023 Max Red Bull, but that so you have to live in a world where you're like, okay, McLaren's going to make a mistake. Like there's going to be an issue. McLaren's going to have a day where maybe neither one of their cars are in the points. So like it's a long season, and yes, we're only 2 races in. So you can't think that McLaren is going to be like perfect the rest of the way. But if you're making mistakes that can be avoided, if you're making those unavoidable, like avoidable mistakes, those are the things where you're like, okay, we need to button this up and make sure, because at the end of the day, those are points lost that shouldn't have been lost. And those are the things that, like, if it comes down at the end of this championship and Ferrari is not in a position, whether it's the drivers' championship or the constructors' championship, and they're looking at where they lost ground, like you're gonna go back to the second race of the season and be like, man, that was it. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that becomes the conversation. Um, I love what's happening though at McLaren. I really do. Like I take the politics out of it because, well, okay, maybe you can't take the politics out of it, but I really love what's happening at McLaren because Lando won one, Oscar won the other. The car is good. And at least for now, it's kittens and rainbows. So I said that I don't think that McLaren is as good as the 2023 Red Bull. Do you agree?
I agree. George
Okay.
Russell, funnily enough, doesn't agree. He was quite adamant on Thursday in China, so before we had the Chinese Grand Prix, that it was better than any car Red Bull have had recently. But then there was an interesting kind of thing he said, but I still don't think they're going to go and win all the races, which I know Red Bull didn't quite do, but they only missed out on one. And he
Ooh.
gave the impression that he felt that Piastri and Norris were more prone to making errors, letting races slip than Max was in 2023, or Max would be now. And that's something I do agree with. I don't agree the car is better than the 2023 Red Bull, but I do agree that neither Lando or Oscar right now are winning machines in the same way that Max has been the last few years. And I think they will occasionally leave little bits on the table. And of course, so far this year, that's proved to be the case because Oscar had that spin in Australia. Well, they both went off, but Oscar was the one who put it on the grass and couldn't get it back for a while. And then Lando, not major mistakes this in China in the sprint. He really wasn't very good at all. Like the sprint qualifying wasn't great. Made that mistake at the start of the sprint, but that's only a few points. And in the race, he was pretty good. And in fact, the only thing I was disappointed by in China was that it was shaping up to be a fantastic end to the race because Lando felt that he was saving tires, saving tires, saving
Oh,
tires to then have a go at Oscar at the end. But then his
the
brake pedal
brakes.
started going long, and therefore he had to basically stop hitting the brakes full whack and start lifting off the throttle early and decelerating from, say, 300 meters rather than 120 or something. Because otherwise there was this leak in the system that would have got a lot worse and potentially
You would
resulted
have
in
become a Fernando Alonso. Yeah.
yeah,
To
exactly,
retire the
exactly that.
car. Right. So I was disappointed in that, but I think what made me the most disappointed actually is the fact that like forget about like the brake issue was there, but like, Zach Brown came out and was like, oh, it was almost a good thing that they had the brake issue. That way we didn't have to tell them to stop racing each other. And like this is a team that all along has been like, oh no papaya rules. We're gonna like, make sure that they have the ability to race each other. But like, no, the real answer to that is that's not gonna happen because they were telling Oscar to back off of Lando like in the middle of the Australian Grand Prix when he was gaining on him. And then Zach came out and said it. So how is this just like a week by week basis? Like whoever goes out and does better in qualifying, you're the preferred driver this week, and we're going to support that driver. Like, how are they doing this?
So McLaren claim it's really a lap by lap basis. I mean, they defended the incident that happened in Australia by saying that they happened to be coming up against lap cars. There was a dry line and a wet line, and they just didn't want to risk it.
Can you
Um,
hear my eyes rolling? Can you see them rolling?
yeah, yeah. It will be interesting to see whether that plays out, throughout the year and whether they do it again. I think the other thing with McLaren is that these seasons where you have a big advantage over the rest of the field don't come along very often, and they certainly haven't happened for McLaren for a very long time. So there's this eagerness within the team not to throw something away because a rivalry develops between their drivers. I think that rivalry is inevitable,
Sure.
even if they keep putting these orders in. I think at some point the drivers are going to ignore it once it gets to a really, spicy point of the season. Um, because they, of course, are also in that position where you never know when you're going to have your next championship winning car, especially with the regulation change next year. There's no guarantee that McLaren can roll this over into another season. Of course, engine change next year. They're still going to have Mercedes engines, so Mercedes are going to be able to develop their engine and their chassis and their aerodynamics more closely together than McLaren will. I think there's a concern at McLaren that this is the one really good shot that might not be replicated, for the next few years. And so that is a very good reason for them to really play it safe. It's boring for
Yeah.
us, and it does fly in the face as well of what they said preseason.
Yeah.
But I think that's the reason for it, at least. I don't agree with it, but I think that's the reason.
Is it? I mean, I think we all came into the season talking about, forget about the Ferrari cars, but when it came to the McLaren, I think we all came into the season looking instantly at Lando as their championship contender. And that's almost not a knock at Oscar because Oscar is a race winning driver, obviously. But the maturity, the chance to develop, having been there, done that, at least in terms of like being in the title fight, it just made more sense to look at Lando and be like, yes, Lando is the one. Why not Oscar? Why not? Why can't he be the one to win the championship for McLaren?
I think he can be. Like, I absolutely think he can be. Last year was an interesting one for Oscar. I mean, what we have to remember is that last year was only his second year in Formula One. This is his third. So there's that. But last year was an interesting one because at times he looked like the faster driver. He also looked like the more confident driver. He looked like the more aggressive driver. But it was only at times. And over the majority of the season, Lando was the better driver, the better all-round driver. My gut feeling, even with what happened in China, is that over the course of the year, Lando's experience and ability will play out. But if Oscar can stay in touch through the first half of the year, I think when the pressure goes on, Oscar might be able to deal with it better. And that could create a really interesting final, like 10 races, 5 races or so, if it remains close. I think Lando's best strategy, I mean, as if he's not trying anyway, but Lando's best hope of winning this championship is to put a lot of gap between him and Oscar at the moment. He did that in Australia. Of course, it swung back in China.
Um, I think if that starts to happen, we will really learn what Lando learned last season about himself. And he talked about it at the end of last season. Like sometimes you have to be in that situation where you're fighting for a championship and you lose a championship to know what it takes to win a championship. And I think a lot of
Right.
drivers who have been in that situation before will tell you that, not just F1 drivers, like drivers in any other form of motorsports. And I think sometimes that happens just in sports too. The team that's like so close, it takes something to like push them over the edge. And you learn something. Like you said, you learn more from the races you lose. You really do learn a lot about your team, yourself, your driving style, all of those things, like when you do lose a championship. Um, and I think if that does come down to the situation where it is a Lando versus Oscar situation, we're really going to learn about Lando and what he learned last year and how much he's able to apply that growth and maturity to a new season, a new situation. So I think we might learn a little bit about the psyche of Lando Norris at some point this year. I think we're already learning a lot about some of these rookies. I mean, Australia was a disaster for, with the exception of Kimi Antonelli. Like Australia was a disaster. Ollie Behrman put 2 cars in the fence. Um, and he was okay in the race. But then if you look at him this weekend, because one of the things that we've talked about a lot is like the way this schedule has played out. You had the first 2 races back to back. Then yes, there's a week off now, and then it's the three in a row between Japan. Is it Japan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, or do I have that?
That's right. No, I
Anyway,
mean,
but
I just
it's
saying
5 races in 6 weeks,
feels
so
fearing
it's
to me, but yeah, it is.
okay. Sorry. It's 5 races in the span of 6 weeks. You don't have the time to sit back and like think about your mistakes. You just have to go out and do that. And Behrman could have very easily been like, man, I sucked. He was stellar this weekend. He did a really good job in China all weekend.
Yeah, he really did. And I think that speaks to the driver that Ollie Behrman really is. What we saw in Australia, fortunately, we kind of knew wasn't what Behrman was about because we'd already seen him last year at Ferrari in Saudi
Nope.
Arabia, which was a very impressive performance. And then twice with Haas, which were also good performances last year. So we knew that he had this in him, but there was just, kind of, is the car there to allow to show it? And yeah, I think what Ollie did there was very good. They put him on an alternative strategy, which as a rookie or as a driver with less experience is tough because you've got to do some overtaking, you've got to make it work, you've got to understand the tires. But he managed to do all of that. And it was a very good weekend for Haas. Of course, Esteban Ocon
Yes.
finishing ahead of Behrman. But yeah, you rightly point to Behrman. And I was really surprised he didn't get driver of the day because Kimi Antonelli did,
Hmm.
weirdly. But I was really surprised he didn't get driver of the day because I think Behrman deserved it. And also we saw so much of his overtaking on the TV. It was there for everyone to see. But still, I thought it was a very comprehensive performance by Behrman and the sort that I think we will see more and more as he progresses this year.
Honestly, it was a great weekend for Haas. Like I think, I said Behrman, but Ocon was great too. And like that is, we sort of started to see some of that from Haas last year. When they were scoring points more regularly. Like we started to see some of the potential that they had there. I mean, they're not, we're talking midfield, but like for them to have the weekend that they did in China, I thought was great. The radio transmission with Kimmy when he was like driver of the day, that was pretty great. But it was again another solid performance for him. He's in the points again. Um, George is on the podium, and we talk about McLaren and we talk about Ferrari and we talk about Red Bull, but how like are we sleeping on Mercedes? Like, should we actually be talking about them more? Because they have consistency outside of McLaren. They have consistency with both drivers. And that's kind of the only other team that can say that.
Yeah, the Constructors' Championship tells us that we are because they're second. I mean, there's a bit of a gap and quite a clear gap on the track as well to McLaren, but they're doing things right at this stage. And I mean, it's always a bit of a question with Mercedes whether since this regulation set has come in, whether they fully understand it and whether, these results come more by luck than judgment. But to be fair to them, and especially to be fair to George, it's been a really solid start to the season. Toto Wolff gave Russell's performance in China 10 out of 10,
Mhm.
which he said he never does. But that one, I need to go into it, dig into what was quite so special. I mean, it's clearly good, but yeah, they were very, very impressed by what George did. And then Antonelli continues to perform. We should say with Antonelli in China that he actually had real damage to his floor. Mercedes said there were actual holes in the floor of the car. We know how sensitive those floors are.
Yeah.
If they get damaged, and also how much performance they deliver, the global performance of the car, a lot of it comes from the floor. So the fact that he was able to grind out that result anyway is very promising. And I think with Antonelli, you know, he's just exciting to watch. I sometimes he's the only driver really now where I kind of wince a little bit when he goes into a corner because he seems to take so much speed and turn in so late or be so late on the brakes. And then of course with a bit of background knowledge of the mistakes he's had at various points in his career, you kind of think, oh, are you going to hold on to that? But increasingly this year he is holding on to them, and I think that's very, very exciting. So I think Antonelli, again, we talk about high ceilings with Piastri. I think Antonelli's is really sky high. So I really enjoy just watching him push a little bit further every time. But
That's
yeah,
the thing,
in
like they have
China
to be
it's
able
been
to
quite
support that. They have to be able to support the thing. Like he's like quite literally a child, but like
yes,
you have to be able to support that X factor about him while
yeah,
also developing him, which to me is an interesting balance to strike. And it takes us back to sort of like I think the Red Bull conversation and how
sure.
they go about developing their rookies and their pipeline and setting them up. I don't know like if let's just live in a world where like Kimmy makes a mistake and he crashes in Japan or any one of the next three races and it's like, oh, he got a little too aggressive and he made a mistake. I don't see Toto Wolff coming out and being like bashing him,
No, not at
which
all. I mean,
which
you
then
only have
like
to.
so like why can Mercedes do it and Red Bull can't?
I mean, I totally agree because you only have to look at Italy last year where they put Antonelli in the car for an FP1 for the first time. He
Yeah.
did one amazing lap, and then second lap he was in the barriers. And but even after that, Mercedes said, "Look, he's a young driver. We know he's going to make mistakes. We have to support him." And again, I think it is that philosophy. And I think sometimes people snigger at it or pretend it, isn't really there. That you don't just blame people. You don't just point the finger. The other thing about the Mercedes Young Driver Program, which I think is the difference, is that they are picking drivers very, very young in karting, and they're picking quite a lot, but they have their superstars. There's the ones that they really think are the real deal. And it's no coincidence that right now, two of those are racing for Mercedes and doing a good job because they were given the support when it was necessary through the various categories into Formula One. George Russell, of course, had those, I think, 3 years at Williams. So that was a nice kind of runway to get up into Mercedes. Antonelli hasn't been given that, but of course, I don't think he wants it. He wants to be in the fastest car possible. But again, they're giving him the support because, you can't compare Antonelli's first season at Mercedes with George's first season at Mercedes because George had those Williams seasons. So it's all just taken into account the person, what they've been through, what stage they're at, and setting expectations realistically. And also, it's that confidence in knowing that there's a reason they pick these guys. It's because they believe they are both future world champions. And I can't remember the last time, other than Max Verstappen, Red Bull picked a driver thinking, this guy really is a future world champion. And you don't want to talk them up too much because, of
They're
course, then you add the pressure. And Mercedes have been careful about not doing that too much as well. But yeah, just that un unerring support at the right times in the right places. Mercedes give that, Red Bull don't, and I think we're seeing the results accordingly.
I mean, Red Bull did. Helmut Marko made horrible comments about Isaac Hadjar after his crash on the formation lap in
Yep.
Australia. So, like me personally, there was literally not another driver on the grid who I was more excited for this weekend than Hadjar. And honestly, we talked about it. Like it should have been double points, and the reason it wasn't was a strategy mistake. It was the wrong call. What did he show you this weekend? Because I thought it was grit. Um, I thought it was mental strength to just the ability to shut out the noise from within your own team and just be like, for lack of a better word, F you, I'm going to go out and do this and I'm going to do my own thing and I'm not going to listen to it. And that's not always easy to do, especially when like the big boss is saying you're an embarrassment. So I was really happy for Hadjar this weekend.
Yeah, I agree. And then the other thing I think we saw was raw pace, which
Right.
is a very valuable commodity in Formula One amongst everything else. And there's no doubt the Racing Bulls is an easier car to drive than the Red Bull, and therefore it's a little bit more forgiving and better if you're a rookie to be in that than the Red Bull. There's some people suggesting that perhaps it's even a faster car. I don't think it is, but still, it's I don't think we should focus on the car in that example. That was Hadjar performing well, doing what he knows he is able to do. And I think that there aren't many options left for Red Bull to start chopping and changing. So I think the one thing Hadjar can have at the back of his mind is like, well, I'm relatively safe at the moment because I can I'm probably going to keep this seat. They do have, like you mentioned earlier, Lindblad, who I think now has enough points for a super license as well. So in theory, if somebody was really struggling, they could swap them out entirely. There's also speculation that Red Bull are going back after Franco Colapinto.
Hmm.
If Lawson gets chopped completely from the program and bring Colapinto in. So I guess Hadjar, maybe I was a bit wrong to say that he doesn't have the pressure at all, but still, I think the way he bounced back from Australia to China, even Helmut Marko, I think especially Helmut Marko, because he does react to drivers doing well as drivers doing badly, will be impressed by that because it was a very good performance. So just more of
Well,
that from Hadjar, and he's going to earn his place. And that's all you can do as a rookie.
the Colapinto ties are kind of funny because obviously like Red Bull had the ties to Colapinto last season when, the Williams situation was happening. And then Colapinto landed with Alpine. And then it sort of became like Jack Doohan, I'm over your shoulder. I'm staring at you. If you make any mistakes. And when we did our preseason things, like when we were asked who was the first driver to lose his seat, didn't I think we all said Doohan, and we were like, oh,
How wrong were
Colapinto,
we?
right? Like, oh, guess we were wrong there potentially. But like, has Doohan done enough to sort of like ease that at least at this point?
Not really. I think, Doohan won't be particularly happy with the way the first two races have gone. He's doing a good job compared to Gasly, and that's where you've got to look. And that's where the concern around Lawson is because he's so far off Verstappen. But with Doohan, you can at least say that relative to Gasly, he's doing okay. He's not amazing, but
Doohan's
he's
doing
doing okay.
okay. Sorry, had to.
Doohan's doing okay.
If you were running an F1 team, this is one of our producer questions. If you were running an F1 team, would you rather have Bortoleto in your car or would you rather have Doohan in your car?
I'm glad you brought up Bortoleto because I'm really excited about him. I would rather have Bortoleto.
Would you really?
Um, yeah, I mean, he's above all else. I mean, even before this season, even before we'd seen any of them in an F1 car, Bortoleto was an F3 champion, an F2 champion, and
It's
then into Formula
quick.
One. Yeah, that's Piastri did that. He was the last person to do that. George Russell did that, and Charles Leclerc did that. So it's a very exclusive club. Early on, what we've seen him do relative to Hulkenberg is impressive. I the unfortunate thing for him is that he's got a car that looked great in Australia. It did look, genuinely quite competitive in Australia compared to what we thought it was going to be. And then in China, it was where we thought it was going to be, which was nowhere. So I think that's going to be the struggle with Bortoleto. And when you're a rookie, what if you actually have one of your performances of your life, but the car's only good for 19th ahead of your teammate?
The raw speed situation, I think I
Yeah.
would take Bortoleto as well. Um, but he's also, I think, what Sauber slash um uh, Audi is doing is
Audi
there's
kick stake.
yeah, like Audi kick Sauber like stake
It's easy to
F1
forget which
racing
one it
team,
is, depending on the day
like
of the week.
right. But I think the thing is the they're essentially giving him, because like this season is a little bit of, like you said, that lost season because of the way things are changing. They're giving him that sort of like Williams runway that George Russell had, where yeah, you're putting him in there, you're putting him in a car that doesn't really have tremendous expectations, and you're giving him that rookie season where you don't have the expectations on him. Like, you don't want him to go out there and crash the car and spend a ton of money, but you're giving him the opportunity to make the rookie mistakes when there aren't eyeballs really on him. You're giving him that runway. And so I think in terms of career development and like the ceiling, I like the situation there so much more than I like the situation, at least with like Doohan is getting. Um, Speaking of Williams, like they're currently fourth in the Constructors' Championship, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on Alex Albon has been the driver of the two thus far. And I think going on, I thought, man, Carlos Sainz, like Sainz is a great driver. But Sainz so far in the Williams has not been the better of the two. There was the mistake in there was the mistake in Australia that we can like boil down to, this is a driver in a car that's like learning the new situation. And so it was that sort of thing. But he just wasn't as good as Albon in China. So what's going on there? What am I missing? Because you're there and I'm here.
So there's been so much focus on Lewis Hamilton going into a new team and all the changes that he's having to make, all the things he's having to learn. And it's exactly the same story at Williams with Carlos. And Carlos has said a lot of similar things. Yet Carlos is someone who's very experienced at changing teams, moving through his career from Toro Rosso to Renault to McLaren, then to Ferrari, and now to Williams. So it's not like it's his first rodeo, but it is still a really tough job.
Mhm.
And I think perhaps maybe, there were a few people who felt Carlos was going to go there and show up Albon, because Albon hadn't had a competitive teammate for so long, between Logan Sargent and Nicholas Latifi. And
Well, and also
Colapinto
I
pushed
think
him, but
when Colapinto, I think, started maybe flexing his muscle and showing his speed a little bit at Williams, what happened with Alex? Alex sort of like uh for like at times it looked like it was shattering his confidence, and any
yeah.
gains I feel like Albon was making, the second Colapinto got better and was starting to be a bit more competitive, Albon started making mistakes. Um, so I
Yeah,
was kind of
no,
yeah.
I think that's where that theory started from. But Alex, I think, has got a point to prove, and so he's taken all the advantages of knowing what he knows and being what he is within that team, and the context he has within that team, and the ability he also has as a driver, and maximizing it. Whereas Carlos just isn't there yet. I think Carlos will probably be pretty disappointed with how the start to the season's gone as well, if he's honest. you know the car is competitive enough to be in the points. It's competitive enough to be in Q3, and he's not quite making that happen the whole time. So yeah, clearly he's got a few things to figure out. But again, like all these drivers, and they do adapt at different speeds as well. That's true of rookies coming in. It's of course true of the Lawson situation we've been talking about. But the one thing Science will get is the time, because Williams have committed to him. So I'd like to revisit that mid-season and
Mhm.
see where we are. Because I think by that point, Carlos might not have made up the points that he's lost at the start of this year, because you never know how season's going to go. And if Williams start dropping out the points, it'll be tough for him to do so. But I think in terms of the relative performance, I would think he'll be matching Alex by mid-season. But yeah, definitely want to revisit because I could be wrong, and maybe there's something more to it.
And if nothing else, give credit to Williams for scoring. Is it as many points already now as they did all of last season?
Right. Yeah.
So credit.
I don't know how the numbers in front of me, but it's something like that.
It's something
Which,
ridiculous like that. I'm really personally glad that we get a week off from making picks.
Me too.
We need a minute to redeem ourselves. And actually, if you like, are you going to see Nate between now?
Yes.
Can you tell him to get his act together?
I mean, you know, that's it's one of the phrases we actually tell each other that a lot of the time.
I told he sent me a message the other day, and I was like, I know you're a big time author now. You don't have time for us like little people, but like, come on, dude.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll mention it over some gyozas and beers because I'm sure we'll be doing that over the next week in Japan.
Thank you very much. You're on a little holiday, so enjoy yourself. Have fun. And if you're watching us, we appreciate your time as well. Remember, you can catch Unlapped all season long on the ESPN F1 YouTube channel. So hit us up with that, the 5-star review, subscribe to the channel. And if you're not watching there, if you're getting your content wherever you get your podcasts, you know the drill. We appreciate it every week. And we'll see you next week.